The past few years have seen a resurgence of side-scrolling beat-em-ups, or belt-action brawlers if you prefer, which have varied in style, influence, and quality. Final Vendetta is the latest game to take a stab at the genre, but does it do enough to stand out from the crowd? I had been following Final Vendetta's development with every intention of buying it on release day. Sadly, life got in the way and I had to skip its launch. Soon after, reviews citing its high difficulty and limited lives were admittedly off-putting, as I usually play these kinds of games with my family, including my children. 1 month in, the combination of a temporary price drop and a patch convinced me to buy the game. I'm very happy to say that the development team listened to its players and added a casual difficulty with infinite continues, rebalanced the game, and also made training mode, which was originally only available after playing the game, arguably past the point you would need it, unlocked from the get-go. This patch, and the changes it brought with it, show a humility and an open dialogue that sets a great example for other developers and publishers to follow. It was incredibly reassuring. Final Vendetta is an absolute love letter to the genre, and anyone who has played Final Fight or Streets of Rage will feel right at home. It's a slower, more methodical brawler. Button mashing isn't going to get you very far in this one. That's emphasised by this being one of the few slugfests to include a dedicated block button. You will need to learn enemies' patterns, watch their movements, and make sure that you don't get pincered or juggled by them. Each character has a basic combo, a super that drains the entirety of an associated bar, and a special attack that drains a smaller amount of that same bar. Using these attacks while your meter is empty will instead drain your health, which my wife learnt the hard way during our co-op session. All of these attacks feel weighty, crunchy, and satisfying. There's a real sense of impact. When you punch someone, they feel it, they stay down. No one's brushing blows off or jumping straight back up. You can combine these attacks with sprints, jumps, and dodge rolls to expand your options. The dodge roll in particular being required for taking down the final boss. It is tough in an old school way. You can't switch your brain off. There's a lot to consider, and the game remains engaging throughout its admittedly brief runtime. That said, the formula's not perfect. Sprint kicks are a bit overpowered, as I was able to run around the screen spamming them without penalty, and enemies can spend a lot of time off screen, forcing you to bait them back into the playing area. This can break the game's flow and add tedious busywork as you coax the AI to rejoin the fight. There's also less distinction between the playable characters than I would like. As a Blaze stan, I immediately gravitated towards Claire. I figured she would be fast, able to duck in and out, weaving around opponents, a fighter who makes up for her low attack damage by stringing together longer combos, and who focuses on evading hits, as she certainly can't take one. And yeah, close enough, I guess. Claire's certainly my main, definitely my favourite character. That's who I'll be playing as in future sessions. I became confused when I switched to Duke, who I expected to be this game's Axel. Even stat distribution, jack of all trades, master of none, yet when I was controlling him, he felt very similar to Claire. My tactics were largely the same. I'm sure there is a difference between these two, but it wasn't immediately noticeable. Meanwhile, Miller is the big, bulky wrestler of the group, so I expected him to handle like Final Fight's Hagar or Max from Streets of Rage, a slow tank that can take a punch and hit back twice as hard. I was surprised to find that Miller's actually quite nimble. His movement speed was significantly higher than I had assumed it would be, despite his moveset comprising of the dropkicks and smackdowns you might expect. On the plus side, the lack of differences between the playable characters does reduce the number of arguments had when your co-op partner snatches your favourite fighter, but on the downside, it also lessens your incentive for repeat playthroughs. Maybe this is just personal preference, but I would have liked the differences to have been more obvious and exaggerated. One thing that has been overstated by others is the game's difficulty. Maybe it's a rebalancing patch in full effect, but for someone who grew up with these kinds of games, Final Vendetta poses a mostly fair challenge. There are some beginner traps and annoyances that I could have done without. This shipping crate will obliterate an entire life bar your first time through. The chandeliers in the manor come as an initial surprise, and I still haven't worked out a good strategy for the final boss's second form. But trophies that initially seem impossible, like beating a boss without getting hit, achieving a 100 hit combo, and finishing the game on hard mode, do start to naturally roll in after spending some time with the game. Some of the bosses strike me as needing a little work. The scientist teleports around the screen, yet often seem to teleport into a grab from me, making the fight quite easy. In the club, you take on two bosses at the same time, which is fine for co-op, but seems unbalanced in single player. Final Vendetta also falls into the trap of recoloring and recycling past bosses as normal enemies. It's often considered a form of padding, and while it's common in beat-em-ups, that doesn't excuse it. To quote my parents, just because all of your friends are jumping off a cliff, it doesn't mean that you have to as well. Although Mum, if you're watching, where did that come from? And what cliffs? It was Norfolk! We didn't even know what a hill was. The issue is pushed into the spotlight by the game's short length. There are only 6 stages, and it will take you between 25 and 30 minutes to complete a run-through. I'm somewhat torn on this. Some brawlers can certainly overstay their welcome. As much as I enjoyed The Takeover, a recent co-op session reminded me it's perhaps a tad too long. Likewise, playing Double Dragon Neon for over 2 hours and still not seeing the credits. I even had to play the latest Turtles game over 2 sessions. There's definitely a ceiling on how long this gameplay style can hold someone's attention for, yet Final Vendetta left me wanting just a little bit more. Final Vendetta has a striking visual style that resembles SNK fighting games, which are known for their massive, highly detailed 2D sprites with tons of frames of animation. The influence is most evident in the shading of the characters' trousers. That's a very high and ambitious bar for anyone to set for themselves, and the game mostly meets that standard. Everything I say from this point on is going to sound incredibly minor and nitpicky. However, when the overall presentation is this good, it makes the flaws that much easier to notice and that much more distracting by contrast. In an odd sense, that these minor complaints stand out to me serves as proof that the overall pixel art is borderline perfect. Although there's a clear SNK influence, the limited colour palette seems to be a nod to my favourite console, the mighty Mega Drive. This is put to fantastic use in the gorgeous background art, especially in the club level, but presents some issues for the enemies. Some of the skin tones seem bizarre and don't fit in. It took me a while to place my finger on it, but I believe it's the wildly inconsistent levels of contrast between each shade of each enemy's skin. It makes some look zombified, while others have shades so close together that their image loses definition and clarity. Returning to the club briefly, there are these divored spotlights that look a tad messy. They add a lot of visual noise to the scene. I fully understand that this is a reference to this stage from Streets of Rage 3, or Bare Knuckle if you're so inclined, but I think it would have been fine for the creative team to have taken some liberties here. A translucent spotlight would have been preferable to the team's rigid adherence to their seemingly self-imposed rules. Another attempt to emulate the restrictions of older hardware is the evident segmentation of sprites. It feels like the body parts were made separately and then composited together. This can make some animations look rather uncanny. The walking animation of the burlier enemies really stand out, with the boss known only as the Gentleman perhaps being the worst offender. This may have been masked better with some subtle subpixel animation and minor shifts in shading. The boss character Diesel looks especially blocky, and I think it's due to the straight lines in his flak jacket. Some subtle curves around the edges of the body could have created the illusion of depth and make the enormous foe look that tiny bit more three-dimensional. One enemy type wears a hoodie, which has far less shading and detail than the rest of their outfit. It borders on looking like a combination of two different sprite styles. I appreciate that this is to show the hoodie is baggier than their jeans, but instead it looks unfinished as this item of clothing is not as densely detailed. The walking animations suffer from the same gliding effect that we see in lots of these games. I think this could have been sorted out with a good old-fashioned head bob. Just moving the head down a pixel for a few frames can add a sense of weight, grounding the character within the world. This one might sound odd, but the final boss's hand seems hilariously huge to me. It was the first thing I noticed about him, and I kept giggling throughout the fight. He got the last laugh by pounding me into the ground during our initial face-off though. There's also a scrolling map of the city in the background of the end results screen that feels like an unfinished placeholder asset, lacking detail compared to the game's other visuals. This screen also has other errors, such as saying my maximum combo was a very nice 69 when I actually got a chain of 103 hits during that playthrough, as seen here. And while the "you are great player" is likely an intentional typo that's a cheeky throwback to questionable localizations of the past, the joke didn't land for me. Like I said, very specific issues that most people won't notice or care about. The presentation is stunningly faithful and incredibly well done. Likewise, I have to praise the soundtrack. It's not the kind of music I would usually listen to. I was very much a punk pop emo scene kid when I was younger, and I find myself still listening to those same albums almost 20 years later. This seems more, for lack of better terms, urban, street, and club music-y. That description alone should tell you that I have no idea what I'm talking about when it comes to audio, yet even I can appreciate that these are some great tracks. Based solely on its own merit, Final Vendetta is a fantastic game that's an absolute joy to play. Where it struggles is in separating itself from the rest of the pack. Beat-em-up fans have been eating very well lately, and in order to succeed, you have to do more than just be a fun throwback. River City Girls has RPG aspects and quests to complete, its own brand of humour, and one hell of an aesthetic visually and musically. Streets of Rage 4 has its gorgeous hand-drawn presentation and the pedigree of its namesake. Fight and Rage has a branching storyline with multiple paths, a variety of anthropomorphic enemies, and a unique chibi art style with exaggerated assets. That leaves Final Vendetta in the same boat as The Takeover. Yes, it's crunchy. Yes, it's satisfying. Yes, it reminds me of my favourite belt action brawlers in the best way. In a sense, it ticks every box, and I should be very satisfied, but I'm left asking what's unique about it. What does it bring to the table of its own, except for the fact that it's set in London? Worse still, it came out in the same week and at the same price as Shredder's Revenge. Final Vendetta set its release date before TMNT, and I do not envy the marketing department the day that the Turtles announced they would be hitting shelves right alongside them. To add salt to the wounds, Shredder's Revenge launched into Game Pass, allowing lots of people to get their beat-em-up fix for, air quotes, free. It had twice as many levels, twice as many playable characters, and the brand name recognition to absolutely bury Final Vendetta. The saving grace is that Final Vendetta offers a very different experience to Turtles. I could play most of Shredder's Revenge on autopilot, relying on the same few moves and combos, while flipping around the screen at lightning speed. Vendetta has a much slower pace, is far more technical, and had me considering zoning around attack ranges, enemy tropes and patterns, and positioning myself while grouping my foes to avoid getting surrounded. While TMNT had an instant, surface-level gratification that might not last a full session, Final Vendetta provides a longer-lasting sense of satisfaction as you slowly learn to master it. The game is priced at $19.99 GBP, putting it at the top end of the genre's spectrum, making it difficult to recommend to anyone other than hardcore fans of brawlers due to its relative lack of content. At that price point, you can absolutely get more for your money. It's also up against cheaper, similar alternatives, which can also scratch the same itch, some of which again have more characters and stages. Its temporary reduction to $15.99 seems far more reasonable, and I would definitely classify this as one to wishlist for a future sale. I want to be very clear that I thoroughly enjoyed Final Vendetta. It has a few rough edges, even post-patch, but it does its genre and influencers proud. I don't think it has tapped into its full potential yet. I would love to see this expanded upon in a sequel or DLC, and I hope it gets the support and sales it needs to allow for that. If what you've heard has piqued your interest, you can buy the game digitally on PlayStation, Xbox, Switch, and Steam, while multiple UK retailers are carrying physical editions.